Welcome to the Interdisciplinary Collaborative Workshops Public Scholarship and Teaching Fall Series. My name is Melinda Lindquist, and I'm an Associate Professor of History at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. I'm one of the ICW co-organizers, along with Ron Amanzadi and Haider Tun, and I'm excited to welcome you to our second fall workshop, Higher Education in Prison. Before I introduce today's event and our amazing panelists, I want to invite you to join us every other Friday at this time for a wide-ranging series of workshops. Our next event on Friday, October 2nd, will take up the issue of voting rights and voter suppression. Please find our complete fall lineup on our Google site. All of our workshops will be recorded and available for future viewing on our YouTube channel. Over the past several years, faculty members and students across our 4 institutions, the University of Minnesota, Howard University, Morehouse College, and Spelman College, have been working together to create spaces for our scholars, students, and communities to be in conversation and work in solidarity. These workshops are an important space where we convene, speak across experience and expertise, cross-disciplinary, institutional, and regional boundaries, and learn together and with our larger audience. Today's workshop, Higher Education in Prison, invites you into a conversation with faculty and students across our colleges and educational leaders in our departments of correction who are working around these issues. Criminal justice reform has been a question of local and national interest and debate for well over a decade. We know that racial inequities are pervasive throughout the criminal justice system, and the movements to defund and decriminalize have been growing. Simultaneously, within this carceral landscape, many people have been working to expand the educational and life opportunities of the men, women, and youth held within the system. Concerns with the lived, familial, intellectual, social, and political experiences of incarcerated citizens, as well as about their preparation for successful reintegration into society, animate debates about the purpose of prison and the role of higher education in that system. Our panelists will examine the politics of punishment, the successes, challenges, and opportunities facing educators working within prisons, and explore their visions for how to create more just systems of punishment and incarceration. So we look forward to spending the next 90 minutes with you. And for our audience, I want you to know that on Zoom, the chat is open. We invite you to use that space to share your thoughts and suggestions and also your questions. You can also open up the live transcript if captioning will make this program more accessible and enjoyable. As always, we hope that the bridges we're building between scholars, students, and community leaders will strengthen the work that's happening across our cities and throughout the nation around racial justice. It is now my honor to introduce you to our 4 panelists and the moderator for today's conversation. I am honored to introduce Sophia Howard. Sophia Howard is a senior comparative women's studies major and philosophy minor at Spelman College. Howard is also a social justice fellow at Spelman College and the founder of Unlocked Minds, a book club in Whitworth Women's Facility, a minimum and medium security prison in Hartwell, Georgia. When not building program capacity and strengthening the relationships between Spelman and Whitworth, Sophia also serves as the student leader of the Learning Club, an alternative sentencing and mentorship program at the Fulton County Juvenile Court, which serves boys between the ages of 12 and 17. Upon graduating from Spelman College, Sophia plans to attend law school in order to become a public interest attorney serving incarcerated citizens in the United States. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sophia. Next, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Adrienne Jones. Dr. Jones is an assistant professor of political science at Morehouse College in Atlanta. Dr. Jones's research focuses on public policies that relate to the Black American experience, Currently, her work is focused on voting rights, the history of their expansion for Black Americans, as well as the reduction of those rights since 1965 as a result of the application of colorblind conservatism in the legislative, judicial, and executive spheres. Dr. Jones is also an attorney, and she directs the Morehouse Pre-Law Department, which provides pre-law advising and resources to students. Dr. Jones teaches courses in American politics and law, and she is new to teaching in prison and is currently offering national government, one of a series of new courses that are being offered by the Minnesota Department of Corrections. Welcome, Dr. Jones.
Thank you.
It is also my pleasure to introduce Daniel Karpowicz. For nearly 20 years, Professor Karpowicz was a director of the Bard Prison Initiative, responsible for policy and academics, and he has helped launch college and prison programs in a dozen states. Professor Karpowicz has been a Soros Justice Fellow, a Fulbright Fellow, and twice a Fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He is the author of College in Prison, Reading in an Age of Mass Incarceration. And in 2019, he joined Governor Tim Walz's administration in Minnesota as a special advisor. He serves as the interagency lead on criminal justice and as an assistant commissioner for policy, research, and planning at the Minnesota Department of Corrections. Welcome. It is also—
Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. It is also wonderful to be able to introduce Janet Morales, who is an education specialist at the Minnesota Department of Corrections. Janet Morales holds a master's degree in educational policy and administration from the University of Minnesota and a bachelor's degree from Carleton College. Morales assists with the strategic planning, design, assessment, and financing of new higher education programs across the Department of Corrections in the state of Minnesota. Prior to joining the department, she led programs at Augsburg University in Minneapolis, which facilitated college access and workforce development for students traditionally underrepresented in higher education. Welcome. I am also excited to introduce our final panelist, Dr. Bahia Mohammed, who is an associate professor of criminology in the Department of Sociology at Howard University, and is also the founding director for the higher education in prison programming across all of Howard's colleges. Working in partnership with federal, state, and local departments of correction, Dr. Mohammed's efforts have allowed approximately 1,000 Howard students, alumni, faculty, incarcerated, and formerly incarcerated individuals to participate in classes inside prisons, jails, and detention facilities in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Under Dr. Mohammed's leadership, Howard University became the first HBCU to offer award-winning post-secondary education to incarcerated men and women, detained juveniles, and their families, and to do so simultaneously. Her work also extends into global issues of imprisonment, as well as the resilience of the children of incarcerated parents. Dr. Mohammed is the author of 2 criminal justice textbooks and the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards. Most recently, she was selected as a 2020-2021 Mandela Washington Reciprocal Exchange Fellow for the U.S. government's Young African Leaders Initiative and the International Research and Exchanges Board. Thank you for joining us. Finally, I would like to introduce the moderator for today's workshop conversation. Joshua Page is a Fink Professor of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota, where he serves as an associate professor in the Department of Sociology. Professor Page is the author of The Toughest Beat, Politics, Punishment, and the Prison Officer Unions in California, and co-author of Breaking the Pendulum, The Long Struggle Over Criminal Justice. He also served as a teaching assistant in San Quentin State Prison's college program early in his career. Welcome to our panel and our moderator, and welcome to our audience. And I'm going to hand the workshop over to our moderator and panel. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Thanks, Melinda.
And welcome to the panelists, and welcome to the folks here that are attending the workshop. We really appreciate you joining us. I don't know about on the East Coast, but today in Minnesota, it's an absolutely beautiful day. So folks could be out getting some last hours of sunshine before we delve into winter here, the notoriously painful winter. So what we're going to do is begin with a set of questions for each of the panelists, some introductory questions that each person will spend roughly 5 minutes or so. And then we will delve into some other questions and have a free-flowing conversation. So, so let's begin. We'll begin with Sophia. And the questions are, we want to know, how did you get involved in prison education? Really, what drew you to this work? And what for you are the most pressing questions or problems that we need to address with respect to higher education in prisons? Sophia.
Yes, thank you for those questions. I was kind of happened upon prison education. I was really interested in learning about and understanding the kind of inner workings of mass incarceration. And I wanted to be proximate to incarcerated folks. And it was through my mentor, Pamela Wen, suggesting that I create a program in a prison in Georgia that I really kind of caught the bug, I guess. And so I've really enjoyed creating the book club turned certificate program this fall, and then trying to create a long-lasting program between Spelman and the prison. It's really interesting, I think, because I value education, I value reading and all of those things, and I think giving the most marginalized, some of the most marginalized populations the access to that is such an interesting form of liberation. And it's become something that I feel very strongly about. And so I'm excited to continue that work after college and those types of things. And the questions that I often grapple with are related to, working inside of a prison, and then also standing for the abolition of prisons, right, and our current carceral state. And so how is legitimizing, giving space, giving resources to the education of incarcerated folks, how does that aid in the abolition of the carceral state in the United States? So that's kind of the question that I most grapple with.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll now turn to Dr. Jones. And if anyone wants me to repeat the questions, please just let me know. Dr. Jones.
Hi, everyone. Recently, since the COVID began, I watched this movie on Netflix called College Behind Bars. And I thought, oh, it would be great to teach a class in a prison. When I was in law school, I had a very good friend who had essentially adopted a friend of hers who was a friend of another person's who was incarcerated. And we would visit that person and at San Quentin, and he would talk about how little there was to do and how bored sometimes they would become. And so this is years later, of course, I'm now watching this movie thinking that would be interesting. And Janet Morales and Daniel Karpowicz were, I guess, already in touch with some folks at the Andrew Young Center at Morehouse College, where I teach. And I was invited to a conversation almost instantaneously after I viewed this movie to talk about participating in this open university program. So after we had that meeting, I contacted them and told them that I'd be interested in forming one of the classes that I already teach into one for the Open University project. And so that class has actually just begun. I have been spending some time this week and last reviewing questionnaires from my students, which I tend to use. And I'm not surprised to find that the people are have very interesting backgrounds. They've worked at all kinds of industries and different places. They are of all different ages. They're also adults. And in my regular teaching experience, I've had good experience with adults who I think often are not there just to graduate, but are there to learn. And I've had good feedback from my adult students that the courses that I did with them encourage them to learn generally for life as opposed to just for the course or just for graduation. And so I'm not yet abreast of the kinds of issues that I think specifically need to be addressed, but I am dedicated to the idea that I would offer someone a venue to engage in material, to engage with me as a professor, even though my course is a COVID course, so I won't actually ever see my students arguably in person. But I still think that it gives people an outlet, it gives people something to do, something to think about. There is a credit associated with my course, so it does contribute to those students in these various facilities who are interested in earning a degree. And so I'm really excited to be a part of it, and I'm thrilled that it manifested so quickly after I had the idea from sitting around Sunday watching Netflix.
Wonderful, thank you. And did you want to pose a question on what you find is sort of the most pressing sort of problem or questions related that we need to address with respect to higher education in prisons?
As I was saying, I'm the greenest of the panel here. And
awesome.
So last week we had a meeting in advance of this, and I was fueled by Dr. Mohammed telling me the importance of people of color giving instruction in prisons. I was really moved by it, actually. So it really just helped me to double down on my excitement about offering the course. So I guess I could say, yes. I also, as my intro indicated, I do a lot of work in voting, and some of what I'm trying to do this year is to get more Black people involved in the election apparatus. You know, we can cast votes, but I need Black people to be counting votes and to be on the state election board and the county election boards. And I don't know that that people of color generally are always welcome into some of these spaces. And I think it's time that we become regulars.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll move now to Daniel Karpowicz. You there, Daniel?
Yes, Joshua, hi.
Oh,
thank
great.
you, Professor Page.
Josh is fine. So tell us, how'd you get involved in prison education? What draws you to this work? And what do you see as some of the most pressing questions and problems that we need to address with respect to higher education in prisons?
Great, thank you. I at the time I first encountered this work, I had been working, can you hear me all right? Okay.
Yeah.
At the time I first encountered this work, I had been working on some areas in sort of we can call sort of structural issues in civil rights law and policy, race-based insurance underwriting, residential redlining, and some alternatives to incarceration, in particular for young people. And that I'd been moving back and forth between that and liberal arts teaching around law and society, kind of the questions of the sort that Professor Jones specializes in, and arrived, I guess, in the wrong place at the right time in the aftermath of the revocation of Pell eligibility for people in prison, which really was devastating and created a sea change where the kinds of professors like Professor Mohammed or Professor Jones who may have had access to engage with students who were incarcerated, those opportunities really were devastated by that shift in federal policy. And so there were some private initiatives starting up around the country of the sort that are being described here at Spelman and elsewhere. was able to bring these two opportunities, passions for myself, really together, and without really any sense of what the encounter in the classroom would be like. And frankly, I think that's, I would segue for that into, both some of what's most meaningful to me about the work and the challenges or questions are pressing upon us about the work. Because, I think, the capacities that lead students of all ages and in all walks of life to flourish in a great classroom with great text and great faculty and great, above all, fellow students, is, in my view, and I think in those of many of us, universally distributed. It's everywhere. And educational opportunities of the kinds that each of our schools here represent is not. It's a very scarce resource, and it's very maldistributed, and it doesn't reach great students and great minds and great passion where they're distributed. And so these classrooms are one way to mobilize what is a scarce and perversely distributed resource to passions and minds and people and collectives of people inside institutions, of course, that are not, that are built to be, to keep such things at some level out. And that leads me to some, that's partly why, even when you're trying to mobilize faculty, as I think in some ways, certainly Professor Mohammed and I, find ourselves doing, trying to draw faculty into this work, that even faculty who are resistant to doing so and hesitant to engage, once they do, they are inevitably, I think as one of my colleagues already put it, hooked. And they realize, I've had very senior faculty who were very resistant to ever stepping into one of these spaces say, wow, that's why I went to grad school. And so, meaning the kind of passion and intensity and encounter and courage, emotionally and intellectually, that they encounter there reminds them of why they first were ready to take such a risk and make such a sacrifice to kind of enter into this profession. So that's an important thing for me, those things. And they lead me to sort of questions or issues. A couple of changing questions about change. I think it's really critical from I think my point of view that we're often asked, does college change people? Does reading change people? Does college and prison change people? And that's a perverse question in my view. The key to this work for me is that when this work is done well, the question is really, first and foremost, will the college or the professor entering into the prison change the prison? This work is not in any distinctive way about transforming people in prison, any more, any less than a Spellman or a Howard or a Bard education or a Think professor at U is charged with changing students. Those questions of change and intellectual and social encounter are universal. So this encounter is not peculiar because of the propensity the possibilities that it opens to change people in prison, but rather to change the prison. Secondly, that's critical to folks, I think, as I would advise, who are thinking about or in the process of starting programs, which is, one of these institutions is going to have to bend significantly: the college, the university on the one hand, or the prison system on the other. And I would strongly encourage people to insist that it's the latter, that the college and the university change as little as possible, not entertain questions about relevance or capacity or interest, and rather replicate, for better and for worse, what goes on at Spelman or the U or Howard or Bard, and rather a focus on making the prison adapt to classrooms of students, to libraries, to faculty, the more difficult, the better, and so on. And so when I think about change, what's supposed to change here? Not the university, not the student, but the prison and its administration. So that's one, I think, and I call that an issue, because I think actually those are not self-evident. And I encounter a lot of people who, for the best of intentions, are trying to adapt or change themselves in order to get into the prison, or expect students to be the primary sites of change or transformation. And I think those two concerns may be well-intentioned, but maybe actually quite problematic. And that's related to the last issue I'll raise, which is, what are the purposes of this work? And how much do they represent a diversion of the purpose of a professor working with any student, or a university or college working on any project, or not. And we will encounter, in the attempts to justify or facilitate this work, a criminological focus for the purposes of the work. It correlates with, or supposedly causes, lower rates of recidivism. Deeply problematic assumption, and even more deeply problematic reason to do the work. And so I'll just leave that as a sort of an issue. Very tempting, very persuasive, and very corrosive justification for the work.
Great. And I think we'll come back to that question a little later. I think there was one posed in the Q&A that we'll discuss it. And I think it's an important thing to think about, just regardless, the response to that question, but just the effects of posing that question in the very first place. So let's move on to Janet, and then we'll go to Dr. Mohammed.
Great. Thank you, Josh. As Melinda mentioned in her introduction, I've spent many years working in higher education, specifically on programs that were designed to facilitate college access and workforce development for students who are traditionally underrepresented in higher ed. And I joined the Department of Corrections in February of 2019, so I'm relatively new actually in working in state government here. But I really think of my work with the department as a continuation of really what I've been doing throughout my career to advance educational equity. And I'm drawn to the work really because of my own undergraduate experience, which I felt was really transformational, helped me become more comfortable with who I am. And as I was learning and growing at my alma mater, I was also becoming more aware of who has access to elite private college educations and who doesn't. And so really, I think as a 22-year-old, I made the decision to become an education professional in order to advance educational equity and inclusion. And so I didn't think my work would take me to the Department of Corrections at all, but I'm happy that it did, because in all honesty, I think that this is the perfect place to be. We have so much untapped potential in our facilities right now. I think, Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think right now there's about 3,500 incarcerated men and women in Minnesota prisons who already possess a secondary credential, and they also have enough time remaining to complete a degree inside. And so we really need to be expanding our higher ed offerings to be reaching all those individuals so they have that opportunity. And I think, in terms of mentioning a problem or a challenge to address, there's so many different things, and I really appreciate the comments of my fellow panelists. One thing that I've been thinking about is simply funding higher education, because higher education is so expensive in the United States, and there are still costs involved when you're trying to offer higher education within prison. And the challenge that Daniel alluded to a moment ago is simply with the revocation of Pell Grant, our incarcerated men and women do not have access to the federal Pell Grant. Even if they're financially eligible, simply by virtue of being incarcerated, they are not eligible for the Pell Grant. There are institutions that have qualified under the Second Chance Pell Experimental Sites Initiative to be able to offer the Pell Grant to incarcerated students, but they're limited in number. And in Minnesota, we only have 4 institutions that are all 2-year colleges that have that opportunity. So really, we're facing a challenge. How do we compensate our colleges and universities who are delivering curriculum and degrees to our students? And so so that's something that I think we're kind of grappling with. In my role in the department, I do a lot of work with budgeting and contracts and managing philanthropic relationships, which are funding a lot of this work. So I think us on the panel would be excited to see the REAL Act pass in Congress, because that would certainly help expand higher ed opportunities and make funding much more accessible for our students.
Great, thanks so much. And
yeah.
Last but definitely not least, Dr. Mohammed.
Thank you so much, Joshua. It's been such a pleasure just listening to the esteemed panelists that I'm here with today. Thank you again for this opportunity. I got into this work because my family members have always been around incarcerated individuals growing up in New York, from Far Rockaway, Queens, but my parents owned stores in Harlem and in the Bronx. My father would always hire formerly incarcerated individuals to work at the store. So these were individuals that were people, always kind of like in my eyes, even friends. I would go as far as saying friends. I mean, I would be coming from school and oftentimes having conversations. These are individuals that, you know, would say, hey, you want a bag of chips? I'm gonna go, you know, run to the store and get that for you. So kind of these secondary kind of guardians, right? And then as I got older, my oldest sister, when she went away to college, did an internship in a juvenile detention facility. I was so intrigued just by the way it sounded. We never really talked about it. We talk about it now, which is interesting. But during that time, she would kind of come home, and I remember always just watching her, you know, because it was, when she talked about it with my mother, it was just something that caught my ear. I wasn't necessarily privy to the concept of juveniles in carceral spaces. And so to hear her say that, you know, sparked an interest in me. And when I went to college, in undergrad, I majored in administration of justice, and I had a professor that took us on a trip, a tour to the correctional facility, the local facility in New Jersey. And it changed my life. I remember riding that bus like it was yesterday. I could feel the hairs on my back kind of lifting even now after years of doing this work. I was so afraid, even in the sense that there were formerly incarcerated individuals who were friends of the family and worked at the store. I never went inside, you know, they were always outside. So I didn't have a concept of what these spaces and places look like. And although the class was called Prisons and People, going in was something that I wondered, like, what am I gonna say? What is it gonna smell like? What is it gonna feel like? What do I do? Like, do I wait for someone to tell me to move? And, you know, we didn't have all of the TV shows that we see now. So it wasn't like I had something I could go to in the media to be able to say, wow, this is kind of interesting. The part that was the most shocking for me was that the university in which I attended, I was one of very few Black individuals, and really the only Black student on this bus ride. And I remember listening to all of the other students on the bus ride, and it was like, everybody was so excited. And it was like, even if I tried to get there, it was not happening for me. Like, it wasn't. I just felt like this was life and death, you know, and the professor bringing us in, it wasn't really like a preparation, you know, for it. It was a tour, like we would go to see like a courthouse or anything of that sort. It was like this educational kind of learning experience that we were to come back and have this very, you know, enriching dialogue and conversation. And for me, my heart was racing. I was really nervous. I was wondering what it meant from the individuals that I met in New York. I was having flashbacks of meeting them, and then trying to think back to think, well, wow, I never knew what they were there for. And so I just was driving myself into a frenzy. Once we got to the actual facility, I felt like I was like just stuck. Everybody kind of got off of the bus and they're running to go, and people were so excited, and that was just weird for me. When I got into the actual facility, I mean, literally, I wanted to just turn around. It was dark. It was, you know, the lighting was, you know, kind of off. Everyone's faces were stern, you know, so although on the bus ride, there was like laughs and giggles of individuals, I felt like I was going to be kept there. You know, I felt like this was a place that was created for me, right? For whatever reason, in my mind, that was kind of what I felt. And we kind of went through the metal detectors. I held my breath, made it through. As much as I wanted to turn around, I have to be honest, I was interested in seeing, right? I was already there, took the ride. So we went along in, and I remember thinking to myself, like, trying to strategize. Should I make eye contact? You know, so as soon as I went through the clearance, I started thinking to myself, like, what is my game plan going to be? Like, do I look at individuals? You know, there's no touching, there's none of that sort of thing. I knew we were going to meet with incarcerated individuals to engage in a dialogue at the end. And so I started thinking already, like, what are these questions going to be? And my hands started getting sweaty. It was just so new. I was just so nervous. And I walked through, midway through the tour, I decided that I was going to look at everyone in their eyes, and that I was going to use my recognition through eye contact to translate the respect that I have for the individuals there. And so that took kind of a lot of courage, you know, because I wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do. But I felt like that would be something that I would do in the hood if I was at home and, you know, an individual just came home. It's kind of like, you know, nodding, what's up, you know, type of thing. So I just defaulted to the codes of the street. That actually made me feel good. Individuals looked me back directly in my eyes. Individuals smiled at me. They had us looking at individual cells, right? So you're going through and you're walking and it's kind of like you're peeking in, and I felt like, dang, I don't want to do that, you know? And the thing that was such a stark difference was, although the bus ride, individuals didn't look like me, everybody inside of the facility was melanated just like me. And so it made me get this sense and this feeling of like guilt that I hadn't necessarily felt before when my dad was paying individuals to kind of work and help around in the store. And so I remember holding that, going through the entire experience, getting to the final session where we sat down to ask questions, and I was too nervous to even say anything. I had all of these questions in my mind that I wanted to say, but I didn't want to get it wrong. I didn't want to say the wrong word. I didn't know what word you use when you're describing an individual, because there weren't really classes there. So incarcerated individuals during that time was the word we don't use, INMATE, you know? And so I wasn't sure how to address the class. There was, you know, nothing, you know, about that. And so I sat and I listened to all the students as they asked their questions. And when I left, I knew that I had to keep this as my major, that this was something that I definitely wanted to learn more about. I wanted to learn more about the criminal justice system. Mass incarceration was, you know, coming up and on the rise, but that language wasn't there yet. Most individuals weren't talking about these sort of things, and I found myself trying to read as much on the topic as possible so that I could just learn more. I remember I wrote in my journal my reflection from that particular event, and I basically was saying that it reminded me of like a petting zoo experience, right? Like we're going in, we're kind of peeking in, and we're, you know, looking at everything that's going on. And, you know, it just seemed kind of off. And I wanted to know why. I wanted to know why it felt like that. I had so many questions for myself. I went through so many different emotions, and I've just held on to that. And what it gave me was this passion and this drive to figure out who, what, when, where, why, and how. And so I continued to study criminal justice theories and frameworks and different ways that correctional systems work, from, you know, rural to supermax, minimum, to, you know, having camps, and just anything that I could study from undergrad to master's to PhD level work to get to the point where I realized that I would be going back, and I wanted to go back, and I wanted to be more informed. And I felt like that was the reason why I felt so awkward. I really didn't know anything. I didn't know what I should do, how I should move, and where I should go. And so for me, when I think about that experience, and I think about the major issues and concerns that I see, I think it would be to promote racial equity. I think as I've looked at the research and as I've been teaching inside of facilities since 2007, all around the world, you know, Africa, India, Asia, Dubai, you know, just all over, it's not diverse. Oftentimes those individuals that are incarcerated are not replicated in the students that are brought in, and they're not replicated in the faculty that are leading the students in. I also think some of the issues from that extend a little bit more in that oftentimes we train instructors, but students are going in under kind of this leadership of the instructor, but my instructor could not save me. You know, my instructor wasn't a Black woman. My instructor could not have imagined what my experience was, you know, because we didn't get to even talk about that, you know, prior to going in. And so I think it's very important that we think about this as an opportunity to also engage with students. The last piece of that racial equity piece that's very important to me is also incorporating families and communities. Over the years, I've spent thousands of hours bringing students inside of carceral spaces and also conducting interviews with family members that can't afford to even get an hour, you know, into a facility. And so I would love to begin to see more programs utilizing a community kind of framework where it's not always connected to a university. You know, why can't a nonprofit, you know, organization come in and it not be connected to the chapel, but it be intellectual and it be engaging in higher learning and experiential engagement opportunities. And I think those sort of models, like what you see in the Second Chances by Dr. Aaron Curbett out of Connecticut, where you start to see individuals that not only go in and when the semester ends, they're connected to those communities that individuals are returning to. So then you have individuals that are actually helping with that pipeline from the institution into the workforce, for example. And so I think really looking at racial equity and dissecting it strategically to incorporate families and communities into this teaching model. And that's what I've been doing a lot with my higher education in prison programs, and including families and caregivers along with students, and bringing the community in. So then we can all work together to solve these issues.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all very much for those great introductory comments. And I think, you know, let's actually go off of what Dr. Mohammed was just talking about and raise some of these issues for the group. And it ties into what Dr. Jones, Daniel, we're also talking about. So, you know, I think, you know, on the one hand, we're thinking about racial justice, racial equity, and in relationship to higher education and prisons. On the one hand, we have the very important problem posed by Dr. Mohammed about how do we get to and advance racial equity in higher education and prisons, right? As well as we can also flip that, I think, and tie it into sort of thinking about how should we actually think about whether these programs work or whether they're successful. Because again, when you think, what does that actually mean, right? And typically the conversation moves right into recidivism and so forth, right? But I think we could flip that a little bit and also think about how do these programs advance or not advance racial justice more broadly, racial justice and equity, right? Which I think ties into some of this. So I think however folks want to approach that, if you want to think about it, if we want to talk about more racial equity and justice in higher education itself, or the advancement of racial justice and equity through higher education in prisons. So I will open it up if folks want to you know, jump in to begin with, and if you want to get on a queue, I can hold a queue. If you want to just raise your hand and I'll keep a list of folks that want to chat. So who would like to start us off?
I can start.
Please, Sophia.
I think that's a great question. I think also related to my question too. And I think one thing that I think people should also interrogate is the education system in America, generally speaking. What's its capacity for racial equity and racial justice? And is this kind of, you know, how many classrooms are following this antiquated system of teacher speaks, student listens, takes notes, absorbs everything that the teacher says, right? This kind of hierarchy of learning that most people were raised in and brought in and continued to have in their higher education systems. And I think that oftentimes when people go into prisons and talking about the demographic of people who have access to go into prisons and have the credentials to have to, you know, even be in a space with incarcerated folks, I think then interrogating how you're showing up, because even if you're a professor and your, you know, classroom is lecture based, it wouldn't necessarily, you know, it shouldn't necessarily be the same setup. And I think that lots of times with the fact that there are a lot of white people teaching within prisons right now, that understanding that the current higher education model is not necessarily the example for facilitating and supporting racial equity. And that I think almost an argument can be made that in doing that, like, space has to be made, opportunities have to be created for white folks to be like, okay, yeah, like the classroom, the teachers should probably look like the majority of the students. I know for myself, I did not have one Black instructor or professor until I attended Spelman. And that's the case for a lot of the women in my book club as well, especially like in the South, and you know how that goes, right? And so I think there are like so many other questions. I think lots of times people are really eager to get inside the prison and do the work and have backgrounds in racial equity and racial justice, but have not practiced what it actually looks like to be acknowledging, you know, the system of white supremacy, and acknowledging that that means that our higher education system was built under white supremacy. And I don't think people want to have that conversation a lot of the times, but I think it's a really important conversation, especially when you're entering a space with such marginalized, vulnerable members of our population.
Thanks. Wonderful. Adrian, I'm sorry, Dr. Jones, Janet, Daniel, would you like to come into this topic? And then you can also go back to Dr. Mohammed. So if you'd like to address this topic, just go ahead and unmute. And
I can talk a little bit about our Open University project, which I think it addresses this topic a little bit. I think it's related because we, I think, with Open University are being more inclusive than we ever have been with our higher ed programming. So traditionally, there is eligibility requirements that students need to meet in order to participate in our higher ed offerings, and we've found that it's almost exclusionary, ridiculously exclusionary, because there's standardized tests that we have our students take. There's also, you know, they have to be discipline free for 90 days. There's all these like requirements that we have for students in order to be able to access higher ed. And so it becomes really, exclusionary. And we've also found that of the students that meet the requirements to participate, 3/4 of them are Caucasian. And so we're really, you know, for people of color who are incarcerated, we're not giving them the same access to higher ed because of these eligibility requirements that are set forth. So we're really working to change that. And with our Open University, this was designed in response to the COVID pandemic. We can't have professors coming in and teaching, and so in person. And so we are delivering higher ed courses via closed caption television, and then also correspondence, traditional correspondence. And so Dr. Jones, as she mentioned earlier, is teaching one of these courses, which is really exciting. So she's been putting all of her lectures onto DVDs for us. And we have another professor from the University of Minnesota, and who's teaching an epidemiology course, and then a professor from Harvard who's teaching a sociology course. And so it's been really neat because although the pandemic is causing some challenges for us in terms of having in-person classes, through our university partner, Metropolitan State University, we're able to have visiting faculty from across the country, from really prestigious institutions. We have faculty of color who are now teaching our students. So really, I think the Open University pilot, it's just getting started. So, we don't have specific outcomes yet to report at this point, but we're excited that it's, I think, really an inclusive endeavor. For many students, this is the first higher ed class that they're taking. There's no other requirements to participate other than having a secondary credential. So we have 185 students at 4 different facilities and 3 halfway houses that are engaging in these courses. So, so we're really excited for that opportunity and to have Dr. Jones on board.
I mean, I guess this makes me think, when I was watching that Bard Prison Project thing, one of my positive takeaways was to Sophia's point that these people were getting the opportunity to do this Bard project because they were in prison. Now, I would say that in that movie, most of the students, some of them were of color. It wasn't very Black. Although some of the women students were, but I guess I was heartened to some degree because folks are excluded from spaces that, if you're going to be in prison, you deserve to get benefits like access to Bard College or access to Morehouse or to wherever else, sort of out of that deal. And, again, I mean, I think it's about racial justice. I do think it's about recidivism. Again, I'm at the beginning of my thinking about this, but I also just think it's about recognizing people as people and giving them opportunities. To Dr. Mohammed's story, I've taken students several semesters, especially when I was teaching in Wisconsin. I had a lot of access on what I would consider these, I would sort of call it, you called it petting zoo, I would calling it zoo. And, it gave my students the opportunity to see what incarceration facilities look like. But I did walk through every year feeling like, geez, this is, they're putting their best face forward. We can only sort of get so deep to understand what's happening here. We take our kids at Morehouse in the pre-law program with the con law class usually to the local jail. Same kind of thing. So I'm always heartened that we're showing up, but at the same time, it is important for people not to feel like they're being viewed in cages, just like we shouldn't have African animals in cages in San Diego. It just doesn't make any kind of sense. So I just think it's important that people have the opportunity to be seen. I'm gonna be anxious to hear more from Dr. Mohammed over time about this community plug-in, because I mean, that's what you're talking about, right? If you're gonna punish people in this manner, it shouldn't mean that they are completely separate from community. We all are in the same community. This Pell Grant thing that I'm understanding today, even better, which I knew, of course, about if you'd been incarcerated, it denies you a lot of benefits when you come out. And someone in the chat was asking about employment. And I think this is so important. Like, if you've been punished, then I need you to be able to reacclimate to society, because we all live in the society together, including you. And it doesn't make sense to punish somebody inside and outside and not allow them education, not allow them a place to live, not allow them to be with their families and community. I would hope that whatever time I get to spend doing this work is a movement towards inclusion generally, because that makes things healthier for all of us.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I love the point Dr. Mohammed, sorry, I'm gesturing you as if you have the same situation on my screen. The incorporation of the community is so important. And so I would, if you want, I would love to hear more of that. So which is one way we could take the conversation. I think a conversation, like a question that came up, or an issue that came up in the earlier comments as well as in the Q&A, is this issue of recidivism, which I think we could sort of think about. I think Daniel put it as a sort of very traditional criminological or criminal justice approach to thinking about higher education, about why it's necessary and what its potential effects are. And I think, it might be worth, Daniel, if you could say a few words about why you find that framing of higher education, which is very typical, particularly in policy discussions around higher education, why you find it perhaps beneficial, as well as, or especially why you find it potentially problematic and constraining to frame conversations of higher education around sort of recidivism and those kind of related criminal justice kind of indicators. So why don't we maybe address that, and then I do want to hear a little more from Dr. Mohammed about this sort of engaging community and bringing that, in higher education, because I think that's incredibly important and not really recognized very widely.
Great, thanks, Joshua. I'd be happy to. One thing I just want to flag for potential future conversation in response to some of Professor Howard's point is what we are learning through the partnership that Professor Jones and Joshua and Ron's institutions in some ways are a part of, and Minnesota State University. It speaks to the pyramidal hierarchy of American higher education. It speaks to the overwhelming homogenized and whiteness of a lot of our institutions of higher education. It speaks to what it takes in mobilizing higher educational opportunities to get inside the prisons and engage with people who are incarcerated there. It's really fascinating. And so I just, what does it mean that why did we partner with Minnesota State University Metro? Because it's a big urban university, because it's got a lot of formerly incarcerated people who are already on campus flourishing and succeeding, and also because it has this tremendous kind of anti-labor structure, frankly, that really doesn't give a damn about the mobilized labor interests of faculty, by which I mean they can accept community faculty like Professor Jones or Professor Wynn from the U, from all over the country. And so it's, organized labor systems. I'll say this as a relatively recent member of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, don't have a great track record on racial inclusion. Let's just put it that way in this country. And so that's perhaps true in academia as well. And it's maybe true in the Minnesota state system as well. And so it's interesting what we just have to institutionally mobilize if we take Sophia's charge seriously to change up who's in the classroom, who occupies different kind of modes of authority, as it were, within a classroom space and so on. It's just really interesting. And I'd love to maybe in a future conversation return to that, because this work, we don't live in a flat higher educational system in the United States by any stretch of the imagination. And what does that mean? We're in a state with one R1 and then a bunch of state U's and then a bunch of community colleges. They have, by the way, held the monopoly on college and prison, such as it is in Minnesota, white, suburban, 2-year technical colleges. Very, very interesting. Why is that? And so I just think there's just fascinating things around the sort of sociology and politics and racialized politics of higher ed that folks on this call are identifying. And practically, as we may become practitioners, how do we scramble that up, and how do we tactically address that? And so I love those questions that have been raised, and would love a chance to speak to that. The recidivism stuff is easy. I'll just dismiss that quickly. No college or university gives a damn about the recidivism of its alumni. That's why. So, so we shouldn't either. That's my one word. That's it.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna return the floor to Dr. Mohammed, if you would.
Yeah, I think this conversation is great. It's just so needed, and I definitely agree with Professor Howard as it relates to, you know, shifting that realm of what it is that we know. It's interesting that you said that, you know, the individuals in your classes, in the book club, and in these sessions never really have an opportunity to see you, you know, to see individuals that look like you going in. And I've had similar experiences where, you know, individuals, you know, pull me to the side, and they could ultimately get in trouble, you know, for doing that, you know, and say, where the rest of the Black people? You bringing some more Black people with you? Like that would, you know, like literally like running me down in these different programs, and basically, you know, getting me to talk more about how can you get more students? How can we get more HBCUs? And, you know, how can we shift this kind of dialogue? And so I started having these racial equity conversations larger, and they get pretty vicious. You know, individuals, I've been told from individuals who've been doing the work that using the language of my people, you know, I tend to say, you know, when I went on that tour, I hated to see my people, you know, in that way. And I remember an older white woman said to me once I said that, you know, they're my people too. You know, I've been doing this work for 40 years inside of facilities. And so, you know, these are my people too. And of course, if that was said today, it's something different than, you know, 12 years ago. So there's this kind of fight, and there's a battle between Black educators being able to gain access to a population and wanting to be able to provide resources to the families and communities that they're living in. And it literally is like this fight where, you know, I'm training Black instructors across the nation to build their skin up, to be able to even go into these spaces. And, you know, my incarcerated students talk about how they felt like I was humiliated in a lot of instances as it relates to the white institutions that come in versus the Black, you know, institutions. The Black students are being over-policed in these spaces where, you know, some of the white students don't even have to go through the testing, where they say, just, you know, don't smoke before you come. Just don't, you know, keep that, you know, on the outside. But we would do urine analysis, TB tests, you know, all of those sort of things. And the only way that I'm able to know that is because we're part of a consortium. So a lot of those students want to take the classes, what they call on the Black side. So they want to take these experiences on the side to just, you know, see what it's like and to explore, get a new, you know, kind of experience. And so for me, the way that I've addressed it is to incorporate family. Because you can't, you know, you can't argue with that. You know, I could, you know, it's uncomfortable to have kind of this race conversation and dialogue for many people. And oftentimes, as it was described in the beginning, people feel like I'm doing this, I'm hooked on it. How dare you come and tell me that I don't belong here? And it's like, you know, everybody's kind of invested in wanting to make a difference and wanting to do work that's meaningful, that, you know, they've been trained for and sought out. But oftentimes it retards the system. For example, there was one of the students, one of my incarcerated scholars, who mentioned to me that he wrote it in an essay. So he didn't ever bring it up in class, but he talked about how he started to hate, and this was the language that he used, his mother and his sister. And I was asking why, and he said, you know, the ways that they speak with me, the way that they're short with me, you know, my teacher, you know, Miss Pam, when she comes in, you know, she's nice, she's soft-spoken, and, you know, she listens, and she comes in kind of what they call in the literature, the over-coddling. And so that Black love that he gets from his mother when he gets out and is sleeping on her couch becomes an issue. Because when you don't allow for the individuals to come into the population where they're going to be living, they forget how to socialize with their own families and communities. And we know that these were processes that happened during enslavement to keep the social capital at a minimum so that individuals could ultimately be controlled. So for me, I think when you bring the community in, it sends that statement that the family can help. And it rids from this kind of savior kind of methodology. Like oftentimes we hide under transformation, which we talked already about on this panel, when in reality, it's kind of a cool thing to talk about with your friends and with your buddies. You know, it's not like these are individuals that are gonna come sleep on your couch. These aren't individuals that are gonna, you know, be living in your community right next door to you. And so I think it's very important that we begin to empower and equip those individuals in the community that will be doing that with the social capital to engage, to be able to have the patience, to be able to hear the narrative and understand. Oftentimes they think that mass incarceration is a rites of passage in the Black community. So oftentimes they talk about it in a way like, you know, there's so many people getting locked up that these are conversations that are happening, and they're not. You know, nobody's talking about mass incarceration at the kitchen table, if they even have a kitchen table to be able to engage in dinner. Oftentimes when people are coming out from incarceration, you might not have even had an opportunity to visit, especially if it's a woman and she's so far out in a remote area that the family hasn't even been able to maintain contact. The most contact that sometimes these individuals are having are with colleges and schools that they'll never step foot on that campus. And so if we begin to include the students and then also include the community, I think that would be a good transition. And that's how I do it in my classes. I have students, I have community members, and then I also have individuals that are incarcerated. And so it allows for me to have a model where the spice is still there and the realness, because I never want to go in and be fake. You know, I never want to go in and not be talking about critical issues and the reality of what's going on, because that time is sacred. You know, this is time that I'm bringing students in and bringing individuals in that's taking away time that a family member ultimately could have. And so, you know, talking with the students and having the family members and community, they're not getting a grade from me. So when they come into the class, they're coming in with real issues and real things. And then it allows me to utilize the literature to be able to intersect and triangulate all of this information. So very high, I kind of think those classes, I feel like it's more of my PhD level classes, my graduate level classes, where it's really complex, deep analysis of lived experience, textbook and book knowledge and theory, and applied approaches. Well, what do we really do about this? And ultimately what I started to find was that the family members began to have new eyes as well, the same way that the students do, where students are like, oh my God, I was wrong. You know, I should have, these are humans and these are individuals. In the families, oftentimes their language needs to be decolonized. And oftentimes the language that they're using is oppressive language that they've been taught in schools and in all different kinds of spaces. And so when they come in as family, they fall back in love with their families. And that's important, because those hearts have to be open, not only on university campuses, but in communities. And so those models that don't require you to be connected to an institution of higher learning, I find that those are more radical, those are more experiential. And for me specifically, being able to bring in police officers, students, community members, all engaging in a conversation, judges, lawyers, prosecutors, you know, it really opens up community to be defined very largely and widely. You're gonna definitely start seeing a change and a difference. And I really do enjoy those classes. And I like that it feels like a democracy, right? So we have a nice range of mixed students. We have different ideas and perspectives that are coming up. It's vivacious, and it really mirrors a college campus. And so I've really enjoyed those. Unfortunately, it is difficult because there are safety and security protocols that have to be upheld. For example, a caregiver has to be on already an approved list. That caregiver, so they would have had to already gone kind of through that process. So thinking through the dynamics of how that community model works is definitely going to take more brain science and, you know, a team of individuals to gain the understanding. But we've been able to do it in DC, in the juvenile facility and the adult facility on the male side and the female side. And it's been absolutely phenomenal. My last class that I taught prior to COVID looked at family reunification, and I used incarcerated individuals who were parents, and I brought in their caregivers and their children to engage in the course. So we were all reading the same things, and they got to hear like from like their teenage kids that were saying like, this theory is saying that something should be wrong with me. Like, you know, what you did, and they're really having like these family dialogue and conversations in the realm of what theories are saying. And the university students take a lot out of it, because for me, it's not just a conversation. It's not just a class. It's about breaking stereotypes. It's about liberation and emancipation. And it's about allowing individuals to see, like, I still see you, like, and I'm still here supporting you. And getting the larger community to understand that is definitely, you know, going to be a feat. The last thing I'll say about that is, you know, at HBCUs, we want to say, you know, open it up, you know, allow the HBCUs, but I've had a lot of difficult conversations with parents who tell their sons never go to prison. And, you know, how dare you, Dr. Mohammed, make your class be inside of a prison, where now my Black son is going to be inside of a carceral space. And so I've had, you know, different conversations with individuals that it is very traumatic for them, and they need to have someone that they can speak to professionally in going in, because they have a parent that's in prison, their brother was in prison, their cousin was in prison, and they never talked about it. Nobody cared enough to engage in a dialogue. They didn't care enough. And they realized when they step foot at the front of the prison, they can't go in. So oftentimes I have to really work with the students, community members, and individuals, because there's a lot of baggage that needs to be pulled apart. So it's not this exciting, you know, euphoric, you know, opportunity to go in, but it's like you going in and you're doing work so that you can love yourself, because mass incarceration is a part of the Black experience across the African diaspora. And until we begin to engage in those conversations about it, we're not going to see too much change.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I want to return to a topic that was brought up earlier. Daniel raised the issue of, you know, what should the university or college change or the prisons change, right? And I think that's a really important point. And I'm wondering if you guys could speak a little bit about how higher education in prisons actually can change the prisons. But also, you know, we often talk about the prisoner incarcerated folks as, you know, the students, right? But I know in my experience, and I've talked to others, right, often the students become part of the program as instructors themselves, or they become going to be leaders in the prisons, in the communities. And so, you know, I don't think we do this work just with the idea that we're gonna, you know, that people will be empowered to create change, but I think that is an effect of the work and part of the racial justice and equity conversations we've been having. So I'm wondering if you guys could speak at all to those kind of issues about how higher education might actually change the prisons, how you've seen it perhaps in your experiences.
Well, I guess my question, or not question, but my thoughts are along the lines of, how do I say? I think that it's such an interesting position to be in, right? To understanding that prisons are meant to keep people in as much as they're meant to keep certain people out, to have the access to be in the prison and to teach. And I'm not sure if programming and higher ed has the capacity to change the prison. And I think that for a couple of reasons. I think that it can definitely change individuals. I think it can definitely change lives and, you know, whole families' lives and trajectories and all of those things. But I I think that I know for myself in Georgia, and having done work in prisons in Alabama as well, it's a whole different ballpark and even negotiating what's allowed to be within the prisons to begin with. And I think that programming, I've seen it happen with my program, I've seen it happen with some other programs, and this may be my experience as a young Black woman, this may be my experience as, you know, that being in the South and whatever it may be, but I've had to conform to a certain extent to even have access to get in the prison. And so where, you know, it doesn't matter necessarily that I go to Spelman or whatever, right? I have to fit a certain mold to gain the trust of like the warden and the chaplain and the deputy warden and, you know, whatever, because the difference between me and the women in my book club are the things that we're wearing. And that's it. And every time I go into those spaces, every time I enter the prison, Dr. Mohammed talks a little bit about this, that's very clear to me, right? That when I leave, it's almost like, you know, like I was the one that was allowed to leave today. So I think that I have really have to press the, you know, the thing that ideally, right, the prison would be changing to fit this kind of utopian sense of higher ed that facilitates racial equity and opportunity. But the prison industrial complex is a system much bigger than myself. And so I think that it can be almost naive or not pay it enough attention to, you know, because of the change within the program, because of those types of things. It's almost kind of like throwing a blanket over this gigantic lion. Well, the lion is still there. It's muffled, but it's still there. It's not going anywhere. It takes more than that to, you know, that might have caused a disruption, but is it causing real, substantial, systemic change? You know, and I don't think that it is.
Great. Dr. Jones, Janet, Daniel, would you like to speak to this issue, or no?
I'd love to engage. Thanks. So when I suggested that in the encounter between the institution of higher ed and the prison, that I would emphasize which one should be changing more. I think my main point is that colleges and faculty and deans, in my experience, rush to change themselves because of conceptions they have about the students they'll encounter, or because they make no demands upon the prison to respond to the, let's call them micro changes that I think are actually quite profound, that the prison does have to undertake to accommodate a professor, students, college, university, degree program, so on. So in one way, Sophia, what I really mean to do is to raise questions about some of what I consider the most invidious changes that faculty make even before they've met their students, based on the presumptions of what they think their students will be interested in or capable of, which is something I find deeply disturbing about the way a lot of faculty engage, right? So first of all, it's just really a note of caution, actually, to shift this sort of state of mind, and especially stop talking about changing students, which is really even more deeply disconcerting. And so, right, because it's like, as if we aren't changed by every time we're sitting next to someone and reading a book together, right? I mean, it's that, and it presumes that there's a particular dynamic of change, and then it gets into this, you know, really deeply troubling sort of narrative about, you know, everything that we do. So that's really the main thing. I mean, I completely agree with you, and I think you're quite right to, reject the idea that perhaps you're being more gracious than that, but to conceivably reject the idea that college or university intervention inside changes the prison system. How do we know that how would I know that you're right about that? Because Pell existed with the advent of mass incarceration, right? So the massification of these numbers and the building this in as a sort of structural feature of the Black American experience and others in the post-war period and the civil rights period coexist with Pell eligibility. So the sort of, that alone should give lie to the fact and emphasize what you said, which is, or at least suggest, I think, that we think about, which is, this kind of work not only heroizes the institution or the faculty, which can remain overwhelmingly white, because look, I've been on campuses where the first thing that the administration wants to do is say, oh, can we count the people in prison for our sort of federal, integrationist agenda, right? You're like, so, the ability of an institution to do something perverse like that, there's no end, to those sort of perversities. Yeah, I see your expression, Adrian. It's just like, it's right, exactly, right? I mean, it's just exactly. And so that's real too. And as well as to make the prison look, as I think I've put it somewhere, reformable or reformed. So I really, really do appreciate that. I would only add, however, that those micro changes are not to be neglected either. What it means to transform time in the prison into college time, space in the prison to college space, the socialities possible of those that we associate with the kind of classrooms or book groups that you will, that's real. It is not a panacea, it is not magic, but those kinds of work that in various ways we all participate in, those are not to be underestimated. And it is very true that some prisons, officials, gates, rooms, this has become very, very small scale or systemic, do change. And those changes are significant. Men and women who are incarcerated in California today, as a result of enormously hard efforts, political efforts, are profoundly integrated into the California State University system. That's a big deal. It doesn't mean we haven't deracialized mass incarceration in California, but it does mean that there's thousands of men and women going to college full time as a reconstitution of what the otherwise horrific experience of the incarceration means. And I do think that matters. And I do think it's different than in Louisiana, where, unless you're willing to deliver the gospel and make people accommodate mass incarceration as if it's, divine retribution, you're not coming in as a professor. That's the truth. And that's, so you're right. These are different politics, but I kind of agree with everything you're warning, and you are identifying, I think, and critiquing certain narratives that are really disconcerting among faculty or institutions. But I do want to also say that I think, colleges and faculty can be demanding more of people like me or Janet, who may have some influence inside a prison system, and say, no, there is an educational hold. And as long as this individual wants to remain in university, they will stay with their classmates and Professor Mohammed or Professor Jones until they graduate with a degree and go home. And that's a change. You either demand an educational hold and an educational transfer, so you are forcing the prison system. I'll tell you right now, I'm in a fight in Minnesota prisons to take classification and movement. For those of us who do some of this work will know what that means, how people who are in prison are classified and moved around by the system, and make that machinery change, because now they're in a reading group or now they're going to get a college degree. That is by no means going to make this, reform an unreformable system, but it is a change that I think is, that it's important to acknowledge that it's there, because it won't happen unless folks like us work with others to make it happen, and they are meaningful. I'll call them micro changes. I just think they're precious too, and the students that I worked with and who are now professors in their own right, or epidemiologists, or all the various things they do, they bring that to this work too, to say, yes, let's you're right, and if we take that as real change, then we've lost before we've started. And so, but I still think we should recognize it, because if we don't, we might lose opportunities to change the space and the time in ways that are maybe within, at some times and some places within our power, collaboratively to
Great.
do.
Great. Thank you. For those that have posted questions, great questions. What I would like to do with the remaining time, because we only have 5 minutes, is I'm not going to address those questions. You all have access to our emails, I believe, through the site, and we'd be happy to correspond with you about some of these questions. There's also a resource site. What I'd like to do with the last 5 minutes is Dr. Jones, Janet, Dr. Mohammed, a chance to either engage this question or to say any final words you might have. I'll ask you to keep it to 1.5 minutes or so you each have a chance. So Dr. Jones, would you like to say a few words? And then we'll go to Janet and end with Dr. Mohammed.
I'm gonna say no. I would like to hear from Janet in particular and some more from Dr. Mohammed. As I said, I'm the greenest here, and so, you know, I'm getting a lot out of this discussion.
Wonderful.
So thank you for including me.
Of course. Janet, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I would just echo what Daniel has said. I think there's a lot to be said about, you know, creating that college culture within the prison, and the collegiality between the students and the students identifying themselves with, you know, a particular campus and their educational goals. You know, I think it can give just you know, this collegiality that is hard to find elsewhere in, you know, in the prison setting. And so so I think, you know, whatever can be done, and as Daniel said, I mean, maybe it is small, but I think hopefully as we can resume, you know, in-person classes, having you know, the education space being sort of a sanctuary and a place of liberation, as others have suggested, I think is a powerful thing. And even with our Open University, although the courses are delivered via television and correspondence, I think, you know, there are students that are meeting in within their living units and study groups and are engaging with the materials, even though they're not in a classroom space together. And so that even during the pandemic, that's still happening. The learning is alive, and the connections are alive. So yeah, and thank you all for being a part of the panel.
Thanks, Janet.
Yeah.
Dr. Mohammed.
Yeah, I would just say this conversation is so rich. I wanted to keep going. Yeah, I think those, you know, every time I walk into a facility, I change that facility. You know, like for example, I always say to the students, like, there's no windows in the facility. So that energy that I'm bringing in with 50 African American students from across the African diaspora, cream of the crop, coming in there, engaging in this rich dialogue, like literally it feels like the walls are gonna literally explode in that place. And it's like, I can't, like, that feeling alone in terms of what it does for individuals is phenomenal. I also think that I've seen a lot of those small changes too. You know, I've seen, for example, coming on to the units in the DC jail with a celebrity. And the next time we come, because there are cameras rolling, the lighting looks different. So me and the incarcerated brothers and sisters are like, yo, we got sunlight in here now. And, you know, we laugh about it. But facts, like, you know, brown skin needs melanin. And so if that means a brighter light as opposed to a dimmer light, that's like being in the living room as opposed to being in a basement. So I think there's small things that we kind of look at and we kind of laugh about, but the brothers do and the sisters do appreciate it. Another thing was for the closing ceremony inside of the facility, the incarcerated individuals got to wear dashikis. And these were traditional garbs. It's the only time you ever saw the incarcerated students' uniform change. And really my argument was to the administration that in the same way that you wear a cap and gown at Howard, individuals wear their dashiki. It's a part of the university, it's a part of the African diaspora, but to wear the slave ship in that particular original cloth, for every individual, it was about 350 of them that we had made. You should have saw the faces of those families. Like they had never seen their family members in like clothes that looks this way, where they could, you know, see them as people. And that was a small change, but it was interesting because all of the universities that came after, they got to wear t-shirts on their units. So they didn't get to move with them, but they got to feel regular cotton. And yeah, it is a small thing, but it means a lot. I know after a long day, when I get to put on a nice piece of cotton as opposed to a, you know, a suit, it speaks differently to my body. And although we know we have so many more things to do and so many more larger fights, those small pieces, I definitely do appreciate participating in having those. It's interesting now when I go back to those units that we've gone on, now you had Kim Kardashian come in, you know, now celebrities are ready, you know, now, you know, we started as the only university inside of the DC jail. Now we have 6 different universities in one facility, in person. I mean, that is a huge change. I mean, most campuses, you have a consortium, it's outside of the school and you have to travel different places, but within one carceral space with federal beds, state beds, private, not, you know, women, men, juveniles in these particular systems, and having them be able to have access to 6 different top universities is huge. When I started at the facility, they only had my classes that were offered. We were the only higher in education program. Now they have a college career readiness unit where individuals are picked up, they're coming on the unit, there's 3 different classrooms on that unit, they're painted, one is green, one is painted yellow, one is painted orange, another one is connected to the library. The correctional officers and staff now follow like a schedule, like a college, so they're picking them up on time. So, you know, I don't have to go in and wait an hour in order to impart this knowledge, and it's running like this kind of school environment where, you know, it makes people feel like, yeah, we could come in and we could do this. The big piece and the big change that I saw that completely changed the DC Department of Corrections was the sense of community. That was definitely a change, and there are so many universities that are benefiting off of that, specifically in the nation's capital, going in and being able to now have guys get haircuts 2 times a week because media is coming in, students are coming in, nobody wants it to look bad. Now the administration is listening to the students. And if you get a haircut, you know, now you're not looking like this animal that they're claiming that you're supposed to be in the media. You know, that stuff is real. Those tropes and all of those sort of things are real. And I've seen those things come down. When I look at 2013, when I started inside of that facility to now, I mean, they even in the maximum unit, they built a college unit. It's painted in nice colors and it has all of these things. Now, when you come back outside, yeah, I get what you're saying, Sophia. Like, you're gonna get slapped with the reality of white supremacy and all of those sort of things. But in that space, going in and recognizing those small kind of things that are happening gives me a little bit more strength to come out and fight this larger fight, you know, on the outside. So I think it's kind of a combination of both, but I'm so happy we're having this conversation. I never get to have this conversation at large. These are like small, you know, micro kind of conversations. So to have this on a macro level means these small things are making a difference, and we're chipping away at hopefully getting towards this bigger issue and concern. And I think we're all saying the same thing. This diversity has to be addressed. I'm actually interested in this open, you know, university. I haven't been able to teach the students inside of the DC jail. They're still working on stuff. So if you guys are looking for professors, let me know.
Awesome, thanks. Sophia, I'm sorry, did you want to have any last words you wanted to share before we close it up?
No, I just, you know, I appreciate, and I know I'm the youngest person on here by, you know, a couple of maybe decades, and I appreciate y'all and all of your expertise and all of those things. And I think that it's definitely easy, especially since I'm in like my first year and a half with my program in the prison, where like the space that we create is our space, but those guards come in and they're rude and they're mean and they are forceful, and it's hard for me to hold on to that like am I making a difference? You know, when I'm not in the prison, these women are still getting treated whatever way. And I don't know unless they tell me. I can't really do anything about it per se, right? All I can do is, you know, be nice to the guard and hope that they're nicer to the women in the weeks, you know, after I'm gone. And so sometimes I can be, it's kind of like, well, how much am I really like disrupting the system in a way that's impacting them, in a way that's like helpful to them, and not just a way that gives another, you know, guard another reason to pick on them or something when they're trying to read their book in their cell past, you know, whatever, right? And so I appreciate all of the things that y'all are saying about the things that you're doing, and like giving me some good hope and energy. So
great. Well, I want, on behalf of the organizers, I want to thank the panelists for being with us today, for your great insights, but most importantly for the work that you do. You know, it's a great deal of respect. Thank you to those who attended and participated in the comments. Again, please don't hesitate to contact us. As you can see, the panelists love to talk about this stuff, and I do too, so please don't hesitate to contact us. There'll be another event coming up on October 2nd. There is a panel on voting rights and voter suppression, so please join us, and that's it. Thank you so much.